are in place because China did a lot of backdoor diplomacy in order to pressure the Iranians to attempt a ceasefire. This is out of character for China. China does not like to involve itself in other nations' affairs. And so I think without Chinese pressure, we would not have the IRGC agreeing to the ceasefire in the first place. The issue is that the United States continues to be unreasonable in negotiations with the Iranians. The Iranians have done a lot in order to try to accommodate the Americans. But, when J.D. Vance went to Pakistan for the first time to negotiate with the Iranians, basically, it was a very...
What is going on, everybody? Jackson here. And I need you to buckle up for this one because this panel goes from a shouting match about American empire straight into a genuine economic gut punch in about 10 minutes flat. You've got Stephen Moore sitting there telling everybody Trumponomics is working, that we're on the edge of the greatest productivity revolution in human history. Cancer is getting cured. Blind people are going to see. Meanwhile, Steve Keen and Professor Jung, sitting right next to him, are running actual numbers on what a Strait of Hormuz shutdown does to global energy and GDP. And their math is not optimistic. And then there's this whole side battle happening about whether America is, in their words, the evil empire, which honestly gets more heated than the economics does. I'm going to break down who's actually working with real numbers here and who's selling you a vibe. So stick with me to the end. Smash that like button and get subscribed if you haven't, because we're the channel that actually checks the receipts instead of just picking a side and yelling. Now let's get into it.
Trashing them all publicly, which is, if you want to get people to help you, probably don't call them a bunch of morons all the time, would be my starting point. Let me bring
but we've helped, we've helped them for 40, we spent $100 billion on the defense of Europe. So, I mean, for them to sit on their hands, I think Trump is right to say maybe we're going to have to reinvestigate this relationship with Europe.
Well, it could just be that a lot of European countries were not persuaded that Iran was about to imminently have a nuclear weapon. And the reason for that, I can speak for my country, the UK, although if I'd been Prime Minister, I would have absolutely allowed America to use our bases for any military action they wanted. I do think that we have quite long memories here of what happened with Iraq, where we were assured that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and we went to war. It cost enormous amount of money, enormous amount of lives lost, led to the rise of ISIS. It was pretty well a catastrophe. So I think people in Britain and others in Europe that went to war in Iraq over the issue of WMD are like, you know what, we're not persuaded. And they should be allowed to be not persuaded, in my opinion, without the president going completely berserk as he's done, because I don't think that helps persuade anybody to help in the way that I think you reasonably put out a sort of narrative here that, yes, of course, all the countries have a vested interest in the Strait being reopened, ought to be working together to do it. But it is quite hard when the guy that started the war but led to it being shut is just trashing you all the time. Professor Zhang, let me bring you back into the debate here. Welcome back to Uncensored. We always get a great reaction when you come on. So thank you for sparing me some of your valuable time. Stephen mentioned there China and why China isn't doing more to help. It is interesting because China really gets more energy through the Strait than anybody else in the world, and therefore has a bigger vested interest, you would think, in getting it reopened as soon as possible. Why is China kind of sitting this out?
Well, China is not sitting this out. We have the ceasefire in place because China did a lot of backdoor diplomacy in order to pressure the Iranians to attempt a ceasefire. This is out of character for China. China does not like to involve itself in other nations' affairs. And so I think without Chinese pressure, we would not have the IRGC agreeing to the ceasefire in the first place. The issue is that the United States continues to be unreasonable in negotiations with the Iranians. The Iranians have done a lot in order to try to accommodate the Americans. But, when J.D. Vance went to Pakistan for the first time to negotiate with the Iranians, basically, it was a very heavy-handed ultimatum to the Iranians. And after that, I think that the Iranians recognized that there really is no hope in negotiating with the Americans. The Americans want to escalate. Why the Americans want to escalate, we don't know, but we can expect that over the next few weeks, the escalation will increase. Trump has talked about using U.S. naval ships to escort oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. This is clearly a provocation, and we might have a Gulf of Tonkin incident, which will allow Trump to justify a ground invasion.
Right, and a ground invasion, Steve Keen, would be, to me, just pouring fuel onto what is already a burning fire of mayhem over there, which I think could be horrendous for the United States.
Absolutely. And I think the soldiers on the ships are having much the same reactions. We don't know whether the nuclear aircraft carrier is taken out by Iranian attacks or by sailors stuffing their own clothing into the sewerage system to block it and force it out of the conflict. Those are our two choices. You have probably the least willing American military in the history of America's military incursions, supposed to go up against a country of 90 million people who know they face an existential risk. It's absolutely ludicrous to be talking about ground troops going into that part of the world. And I've had, I'm not an expert in military matters either. We've all acknowledged that. But from what I've got from reports of people who I know are experts in that area, unless the Americans have Star Wars-style weapons to use against the Iranians, and this is going to be a slaughter of those American troops. And then I completely agree. This has probably been set up as another false flag, which America should be famous for. The Gulf of Tonkin, which dragged them into the Vietnam conflict in the first place, was put across as an attack by American ships in international waters. It was actually an American attack within Vietnamese waters. All this stuff, America sets up these wars and then loses them.
You've described Donald Trump as an anarchist who behaves like a mafia boss with no idea of consequences. And you've sent this message to world leaders: get rid of Trump, stop this. America has to concede defeat and step back to give us a chance to rebuild the world's physical infrastructure before global famine sets in. You added, it's a clusterfuck coming out of America. If you're going to see regime change to stop this war, forget about seeing it in Iran. You need to see it in America. I mean, that's strong rhetorical stuff there. Just explain what you're getting at.
Well, first of all, I mean, my perspective on Trump comes from having a personal relationship with somebody with narcissistic personality disorder. And everything, I think the one advantage of that relationship in the long term was I understood Donald Trump, I think. And that is that he simply wants to make himself the center of attention. And it doesn't matter how you do it. You make a center of attention by giving a nice dance or by invading another country. He just wants to be the center of attention. I think that's why he fell for Netanyahu's provocation, which 40 years of previous American presidents have resisted, and went in the belief that it would be over in a couple of days. I mean, all the talk about, we've got to get Iran to be reasonable, the Iranian regime, yada, yada, yada. The very first thing the Americans did was assassinate the top leadership of the country, including the father and I believe the wife of the new leader. You want to be taken seriously as somebody to negotiate with? That just tells you don't negotiate, defeat them on the ground. And just like Vietnam was a war where they brought in enormous firepower and lost to a guerrilla army, this is bringing in enormous firepower and taking against a political system which has broken itself into 31 like heads of a hydra so that you can't take it out collectively. So all America's tactics have backfired so far. They'll continue backfiring. The only way out is for Donald Trump to declare victory while conceding defeat.
Stephen Moore, I mean, look, I can't imagine a scenario where Donald Trump tries to get out of this without at least presenting a case for total victory. That's his nature. But in terms of this war and the impact it's had on his legacy, how was the tariff war doing before all this? In other words, the Trumponomics, which he launched with a huge gusto, a kind of year ago, how was that playing out, do you think, globally before this? In other words, was his economic strategy, do you think, working? And has this put everything back, or was it not really working and this has added to the general sense of chaos?
Well, first of all, I just have to say, I mean, come on. It seems like you all can't determine who's the good guy here and here's the evil. And by the way, I'm not even a big fan. You're the bad guys, for God's sake. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's my point. If you actually think that we're the bad guys and the Iranians the good guys, you have a personality disorder, my friend. I'm sorry. And it really is amazing that you think that we're the villains here and that this is a regime. And by the way, again, I wasn't even necessarily in favor of this incursion in the first place. But come on, this is a regime that was killing thousands, murdering their own people. This was a regime that's building a nuclear weapon. So how are we the bad guys by trying to save lives? And I do think, I think to Trump's credit, he did view this as a humanitarian mission to save lives that were being slaughtered. Now, in terms of our economy, we've had now 5.5 years of Trump's presidency with an incredibly strong economy. Trumponomics has worked. If it hadn't been for COVID, Trump would have been reelected with a 40-state reelection landslide. The economy was very strong going into 2026. And it's true that the Iran situation has really changed that picture dramatically, which is why Trump really needs to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. But by the way, I'm not just attacking Steve. I think there are a lot of foreign leaders too who can't seem to figure out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here. That's very troubling to Americans.
I was facing being conscripted to fight for freedom in Vietnam. And the one thing that threw me is, why am I being conscripted to fight for freedom? Okay, you go into Vietnam, you attack it, your whole thing is about going to stop the communist invasion of Southeast Asia. Who was the first country Vietnam has a war with? China, the first and last war. That turned out completely against what you thought was going to happen. Afghanistan, Iraq.
I was against all those things.
You should be against this one as well. Grow up. Okay, if you can't realize that America is the evil empire here, then you've...
It's the United States. You're saying the United States is the evil empire.
Yes, the United States began this. What country has invaded America? How many countries has America invaded? Please, stop reading Hollywood scripts and realize which planet you're on.
I seem to think that 9/11 was an attack on America. Maybe you don't agree with that, but...
Yes, okay, that's which country I said before.
Oops, you forgot about that one, right?
No, I didn't forget. I said country, and no country did that. That was a rogue, and the rogues came from Saudi Arabia, not from the bloody country you raided and the results to it. You guys have got a Hollywood version of your own history. It's a joke from the outside. Nobody takes you seriously anymore.
Before the evil empire, why is it every immigrant in the world wants to come to the United States?
Nobody wants to go there now, mate. And you are going down.
You should be at the border. You should see. We have millions of people who are signing up to get visas to come to the United States. They don't want to go to any other country. They want to come to the U.S.
I mean, look, from my point of view, let me be crystal clear. I do think Iran is an evil regime. For 47 years, it's been oppressive to its own people in a despicable way. And also, it's been the key sponsor of terrorism to the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Through the last few decades, and we've all seen where that has led, and that's been part of the big picture problem. President Zhang, let me bring you back in here. People are looking at manufacturing resilience as one of the reasons why China ultimately will prevail here in the economic aspect of what is going on. That China's moved beyond cheap labour to advanced automation. Steve Keen has noted that if global trade stops, China has the internal infrastructure to survive, whereas the West has outsourced its survival. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the past couple months, China has been much more resilient and much more able to adapt to a new economic circumstance than other countries in Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines and Thailand. And Japan's also a lot of stress as well. So it seems like the Chinese government has been preparing for this eventuality for a long, long time. They've been very strategic. They've been very long-term in their thinking. The issue is that the long-term strategic scenario does not favor China because China is still an economy that depends on exports. And if there are these wars raging around the world, then it's going to be very hard for China to export its manufactured goods to the rest of the world. The second issue is that China consumes a lot of resources. Yes, I do understand that China has renewables, and I do know that China has a lot of inventory and stockpiles, but eventually all this is going to run out. So from a long-term strategic perspective, China is not as well adapted to a change as, say, maybe Russia or the United States.
Will what's happened here with Iran, and actually to a lesser degree, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has also been now, we're 4 years in now, and it's becoming a real quagmire. Will what's happened deter China from?
All right. So here's what actually matters underneath all that shouting. Two completely different visions of reality got presented back to back, and only one of them came with numbers attached. Stephen Moore's pitch was Vives Forward, strongest economy in years, robotics revolution incoming. This is basically the best moment in the history of civilization to be alive. Steve Keen's pitch was a specific claim. A 10% drop in energy output translates to something like a 10% drop in GDP, and he's calling that depression-level math, not a garden variety recession. That's a testable claim. It's not a mood, it's an equation, and it deserves to be checked against real data rather than waved off with a line about robots curing cancer. Then you've got the dollar figures thrown around in the piece. A war cost estimated in the billions per day, a $1 trillion total projection attributed to a Harvard public policy professor, a described jump in gas prices, a described House vote to limit war powers. I want to be straight with you. I haven't independently verified every one of those specific numbers, and neither should you take them as gospel, just because they got said with confidence on camera. What I can tell you is this: the pattern of confident optimism with no numbers versus specific, checkable claims with sourcing is the actual story here, regardless of whether every individual figure holds up exactly as stated. And then there's the whole evil empire argument, which honestly generated more heat than light. Calling a country evil in the abstract doesn't tell you anything useful, and neither does responding to it by asking why. Immigrants want to move there. Both of those are appeals to emotion, not arguments about the actual military and economic decisions on the table. The more useful question buried in there was about Article 1 war powers and whether Congress actually authorized this action, because that's a concrete constitutional question with a concrete answer, not a rhetorical one. Here's my actual takeaway. When you're watching a panel like this, separate the predictions that come with a mechanism, energy drops, GDP falls, here's why, from the predictions that are just confidence with nothing under the hood. That's true whether the person doing the predicting is an economist you like or one you don't. So tell me in the comments, are you buying the productivity revolution optimism, or does the energy math worry you more? And if you want more breakdowns like this, the ones that actually separate the argument from the noise, get subscribed, because that's exactly what this channel is built to do.